Hello, I'm Megan McCart, and I'm going to be discussing privatized prisons. History and background. The first formal privatized or for profit prison in the United States dates back to 1852 in San Quentin, California. Private, pri- Private prisons gained popularity in the 1980s. During this time, President Ronald Reagan escalated the war on drugs, flooding the U.S. prison system. By 1990, state prisons reached 115% capacity. Voters supported the criminal justice policies, but they didn't support an average of 60% bond referendum in the 1980s. To fill in the financial gap, states turned to private contractors. The theory was that private prisons would operate with an increased efficiency and save money. Also, leaving room for competition would supposedly force accountability. Texas was the first state to adopt legislation about private prisons in 1985. But Kentucky was the first state to actually open a private prison in 1986. Facts and numbers. The United States has the world's largest private prison population. Roughly 8.5% of U.S. prisoners are in private prisons. In the same vein, 73% of people in immigration detention centers are in privately owned facilities. From 2000 to 2016, the number of people housed in private prisons increased 5 times faster than the overall prison population. During a similar time frame, the proportion of people in private immigration detention centers increased by 442%. The federal government utilizes private prisons along with 27 states. New Mexico and Montana lead the country with 43% and 39% respectively of the private prison population. These graphs show the use of private prisons has increased in the United States in both federal and state-ran facilities. I would like to draw your attention to the federal graph. You can see a massive increase from 2000 to 2010. This map shows which states utilize private prisons. The color scales show the percentage of people in private prisons. The tan color indicates no private prisons used within the state. The navy blue indicates greater than 30% of people in private prisons. As stated previously, New Mexico and Montana led the United States in the use of private prisons. Problems with privatized prisons. Unlike government-ran facilities, private prisons report to their investors, shareholders, and boards. They have a duty to maintain a profitable bottom line. This means that they need to keep incarceration rates high to make a profit. Along with keeping incarceration rates high, private prisons tend to keep prisoners longer than public institutions. Prisoners in private prisons are 15% more likely to receive infractions, which in turn makes it less likely they will get granted parole. Overall, the criminal justice system disproportionately incarcerates people of color. People of color are more likely to be remanded to private prisons than white prisoners. They also have longer sentences and are less likely to be paroled. Private prisons are also known for issues related to overcrowding, riots, understaffing, and the lack of medical care. Seth Freed Wessler is an independent reporter working for the Investigative Fund. In August of 2016, he did an interview on NPR about the conditions of 13 privately operated prisons in the federal system. He spent 4 years looking at medical records and reports made at these facilities. One particular case that stood out was Claudia Saucedo. Saucedo was in his early 40s and incarcerated in West Texas. Soon after arriving at the facility, he began to complain of back pain. Over the next 2 years, he made 18 formal complaints. Repeatedly, he was sent back to his cell with Tylenol from vocational nurses. No medical doctor was on staff. One day, he collapsed. He was sent to a local hospital where he was immediately tested positive for AIDS. He died a few days later, from AIDS-related illness. Prisoners are supposed to be tested for HIV when they arrive at correctional facilities. According to his medical records, doctors knew he was HIV positive. Not only did he needlessly suffer for roughly 2 years, if he had received adequate medical care, he could have been alive. Claudio's story is just one of many that have suffered at the inhumane treatment or death at the hands of private prisons. Private prison scandals. Private prisons are not immune to scandals or bad press. It actually seems like they attract them. The first example I want to talk about is the Kids for Cash scandal in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 2 Philadelphia judges, Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan, shut down a county-run juvenile detention facility and accepted $2.8 million in illegal kickbacks from the builder and co-owner of 2 new for-profit detention centers. Ciavarella ran a no-tolerance policy and sentenced children as young as 8 years old to detention. Many of the children were first-time offenders. Their crimes included things like petty theft, jaywalking, truancy, or really other minor infractions. The judge would often order the kids to be immediately taken into custody without a defense or even a goodbye to their families. In the end, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court threw out over 4,000 juvenile convictions involving more than 2,300 kids. Both judges were ordered to pay back more than $200 million to the families and to the state. Ciavarella was sentenced to 28 years in prison, and Conahan was sentenced to more than 17 years in prison, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, he was released into house arrest for the remaining 6 years of his sentence. The next example is the East Mississippi Correctional Facility. They were brought to court in a federal civil rights trial. Evidence and testimony showed the house of horrors that the company repeatedly called safe and clean. Some examples include a man on suicide watch was able to hang himself. Gangs were being allowed to beat up other prisoners, and medical neglect. Many times when they would be on lockdown, other inmates would be seen strolling around the facility as if nobody else was there. So many of these men testified in the trial that the judge complained of exhaustion. The Management and Training Corporation is the private company that runs East Mississippi Correctional. They also run 2 federal prisons and oversee 20 other facilities across the United States. Other problems within the facility include low pay for officers starting at just $12 an hour and only 3 weeks of training. State-ran facilities require a minimum of 6 weeks training. They also don't maintain a full staff of guards on a regular basis. These are 2 photos that were shown in the trial about what happened in East Mississippi Correctional. The top left photo shows a fire that was ignited by inmates outside of somebody's cell. The bottom right-hand photo shows the condition of what an inmate was living in a cell. You can see the blood pooling on the floor, the rusted out bunks, and very unclean situation. Potential solutions. During the Obama administration, the Assistant Attorney General declared that no current contracts with private prisons be renewed to phase them out, and there were to be no new ones implemented. In 2017, during the Trump administration, the Attorney General rescinded the order. This would actually be the start to getting private prisons abolished. New facilities would need to be built and new staff at each one. The biggest argument against this is time and money. Currently, President Joe Biden has issued an executive order to end the federal government use of private prisons. This does not include private immigration detention facilities. This is similar to the Obama order, except that Biden's also includes the U.S. Marshal Services. To get around this, private companies are now working with the government to stay in business. Overall, money is the biggest factor when it comes to private prisons. Until that incentive is taken away, there will be more corruption and more harm to prisoners. What the normal person can do to help this solution, to guide a helpful solution, is to start lobbying and advocating and voting for the reduced use of private prisons until it's absolutely abolished in the United States. We're supposed to be in a democracy where you're supposed to be able to talk about, things that are not right. We're supposed to be able to vote against those. And that's one of the best ways to be able to do this, is to just make your voice heard. That concludes my presentation.